Hello, I'm back. Nearly started this video off with "we" for some sort of weird royal vernacular idea when it comes to these videos, but I'm trying to stop my adult brain from doing that. This is a Totemic Enhancement Shaman PvP guide. Oh, so many words. But what we're going to do is break down a lot of the pieces that come along with Totemic Shamanism and explain it bit by bit. And first, we're going to start off with the build, which is typically where you kind of need to begin everything of how it's going to go. Now, you can pause the video right now or look in the section below where I'm going to leave the little code for importing this exact build into your system. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk about some of the abilities and why I'm using them and for what purpose. Now, as you can see here, when we're doing a totemic build, we're basically keeping to Doomwinds, Hailstorm, and a Lava Lash build, which means that your Lava Lashes are going to be very strong because once you put down your Surging Totem, it's going to create a mini little sundering there. And that is going to be a huge chunk of your damage, and also add to your burst damage as it is a relatively high-hitting move. Hailstorm is what happens when you empower your frost shocks with your Maelstrom spenders. So basically, once you spend 10 Maelstrom on either healing or an elemental blast, which is the other part that you're taking with this build, it hits for exceptionally hard after you empower it with an ice strike. So you're basically compounding two modifiers onto that attack, and it hits for a substantial amount. And then last but not least is Doomwinds. Now Doomwinds doesn't hit by itself for a huge amount, but what it does is add a bunch of little bits onto whatever damage you're doing. And I'm going to break down Doomwinds a bit more when I talk about rotation and how it's going to come about, but I just wanted to curtly go about it to explain what the sort of tentpole abilities are of this and what you really want to keep no matter what. Some things can be jiggled about, but for the most part, this is how it's going to look, along with getting your Primordial Wave and Feral Spirit, so you have your puppies in a very, very hard concussive attack when you're fighting anybody in solo shuffle or blitz. Now, some of the other things that you might see here is having cleanse. Now, this is one of those situational things. If you are not fighting another shaman or a warlock, you don't need cleanse. Cleanse is only good for curses, and if you aren't fighting something with curses, you might as well use it to something else. And I will always go for Voodoo Mastery, which cuts your hexing in half and brings it down to 15 seconds. It just helps with either creating or alleviating pressure in the middle of a match, and something that I would highly recommend folks look into when they're doing it. But it's not end of the world if you don't have it. It's just one of those nice to have things and gives you a point back when you're in these sort of matchups that don't exactly favor you. Same as Seasoned Winds. There'll be times where you're fighting hunters, rogues, warriors, and they'll be there with a healer of most any veracity, and you don't need to reduce the amount of magical damage you're taking from them. So you can put Seasoned Winds into something else like Nature's Fury, which increases the critical damage of your nature spells by 4%, which is handy because a lot of this bends around having stuff like Elemental Blast and Primordial Storm, which both have nature elements in them. Not primarily, but a little bit. You can also switch it over for Traveling Storms, which is that which takes your thunderstorms and makes them a further knockback with a greater slow at the end of them. Now, a lot of the classes you fight are going to basically kind of close the gap instantly, but that's an advantage because that means that you've made them utilize and waste one of their traveling and gap closing abilities to get back to you or someone else, because Traveling Storms can be cast on somebody else, which is fantastic for pressure on your partner, especially if you're partnered with someone who's ranged and they need to get the people off to be effective. We also got Totemic Recall here, which is to reset your most recently used totem on a 3-minute cooldown, only up to 3 minutes. So it won't work for all of your totems, but it is a handy thing to combine with your capacitor totem or your static totem, which gives you basically 2 charges of them back to back. You do need to remember it though, and that's always the difficult part because you're in the middle of a melee, everything's going off all at once, and you have to think really hard. Okay, I've used this totem, now I need to use Totemic Recall and have it come back to me. And there may be times where you don't wish to take it or have the button bloat, and you'll see a lot of shamans, both enhancement and elemental, go to Guardian's Cudgel, which means nothing to nobody, but it's the skill that allows your totem to come back instantly after it's destroyed or it goes off. So you get 2 static or 2 capacitor totems that stun your opponents for 2 seconds back to back. Now, this is a double-edged sword, because what this will do is also greatly increase the diminishing returns on whatever you're fighting. So paired with a rogue of any veracity might not be the best thing, because you're using your 2-second stun for what could be their 5-second stun. So same as a Rep Paladin, it's sometimes not the greatest thing and needs to be used sparingly, and also with whatever you're focusing on, because maybe the rogue is handling all of the peels and creatures right in front of you, people right in front of you, creatures, other players in the world who are human beings who live and breathe and are also trying to win at the match. And perhaps you could use your capacitor totem on a ranged class that isn't exactly nearby you or the rogue, or a healer who, you know, you could win matches in that 2-second heal. Now, on to the glorious PvP talents. We have a glut of talents that are all fantastic and wonderful to use, and a lot of these can be interchangeable. I really do enjoy having Static Totem when you're fighting classes that are fantastic at kiting, such as a Marksman Hunter or a Frost Mage or any sort of mage, to be honest, because you can static them, bring them back to you, and then recast your Static Totem, and then keep them close by for as much DPS as possible. However, you could swap this around for Shamanism, which allows your Bloodlust to be used once every minute in the PvP matches. And what I like to do is I macro my Shamanism with one of my go buttons. Most often, Primordial Wave. And that's because Primordial Wave will already give you a bit of haste, and I'll go into this deeper when I get there, and I'll also input some macros down below as well to explain what I'm doing. But it's just a huge DPS boost, and also can be cast on your partner, who will also have a gigantic DPS boost. The other one that is a very wonderful one to use is Counter-Strike Totem. Again, melee heavy lobbies, and you can hopefully sometimes compound some of their damage, or even alleviate some of the pressure that's on you by forcing them to stop hitting you, turn and attack that totem. It might only be a global that you're saving yourself from, but that global can win you a match, especially when it's taking pressure off of your healer, or hopefully they don't see it and they hurt themselves really badly and you win, and then you feel very proud of yourself despite Counter-Strike Totem being your #1 damage dealer. Now, the other last one here is we have Stormweaver. Stormweaver turns all of your Maelstrom spent into a heal. Now, this is a very, I'm not going to say cumbersome, but you do have to think about what you're doing, because basically you're building yourself 8 to 10 stacks of Maelstrom, spending it on something like Elemental Blast, and then you're able to heal. Now, the problem here comes that it only lasts until your next Maelstrom. And what might happen is you could replace that 10 stack with a 5 stack, and then your heal is diminished that much. However, it does give you some of the biggest heals in the game. So instant cast heals within a solo shuffle match. Not in the game, but they're gigantic and life-saving and something absolutely worth considering. Now, in your Totemic build, you don't build Maelstrom quite like you do in the other build, your Stormbringer build, but it still is worthwhile doing and still helps quite a bit. But if that's something that you don't want to take, Burrow is your conversely wonderful defensive ability and cooldown that will keep you alive in a lot of high pressure situations. Now, Burrow doesn't remove dots or any sort of damage over times, but it will stop the pressure and give a healer a chance to bring you back up to full and, you know, stop whatever sort of horrors are being rendered upon you. So it's a wonderful tool to use, and a lot of these get kind of intermixed because stuff like Static Totem and Counter-Strike Totem are all actively used abilities, same as grounding. So you have to get used to where those buttons are and how to use those buttons, where something like Stormweaver, actually I shouldn't say that, Burrow is also another ability. So you're kind of increasing your button bloat that much more, but it is worth it, and they're absolutely devastatingly useful PvP talents to take that also do come with situational awareness. So you might be in a moment where you don't need that static, so you'll take Shamanism and Grounding, and then your third ability being Burrow or Stormweaver. Because I typically will flop between the two, and I've seen some Shamans who take both Burrow and Stormweaver for the extra heals and the damage mitigation when it comes. But you really need to go to what you're comfortable with and what works for you, and also what you're fighting against, because there will be times where you'll step into a lobby with a lot of just horrifying burst damage, and when you get into those sort of lobbies, you're better off with Burrow than you are with Stormweaver, because you will not garner the Maelstrom to get yourself up to full, and you're better off just to Burrow, get away, and stop their pressure on you for that amount of time, especially when they're building it. Outside of that, we're going to get into the rotation next, but that's mostly everything of what you need here. So let's keep going. So, rotation, or at least burst rotation, with a bit of rotational explanation towards the end of this. But this is going to be how you want to start most of your fights, or at least when you're in a burst window to try and down your opponents during a solo shuffle or out in the world with Blitz or your 3v3s. Now, for starters, as always, you want to make sure everything is buffed, that you have your Wind Fury, Flame Tongue, Sky Fury, and Lightning Shield all buffed. Earth Shield as well, if you decided to take that talent. And then we're going to start very slow. And not only will we start slow, but I'm also going to put on screen what I'm doing at that time and keep it up on screen for anybody to follow at a later period. Beyond that, if you really want to help yourself, don't be afraid to write it down, because that is actually one of the best ways to retain knowledge and information and remind you of things when it comes to recalling them over just seeing it. However, maybe just listening to it and repetitively doing it over and over again until it becomes ingrained in you helps greatly. Do whatever works best for you, but this is what I will do for my burst rotation. So we come up on the target, and this is all assuming that the target's not going to move. We start with Flame Shock, and that's to make sure that we get our damage over times down. Now, if they are a moving target, you'll then want to go on to Frost Shock to make sure that you can catch them with the greatest of ease. Oh, so much talking. I already gotta redo Flame Shock. Then after that, you want to go into Surging Totem. That is going to be a lot of your primary damage dealers. From here, we're going to get our puppies up and use Feral Spirit. Then from there, we're going to use Primordial Wave, Doomwinds, and then once we get 8 or above stacks, we're going to use Primordial Storm. Now, before I go on any further, I'm going to explain why that order is why it is. Because Primordial Wave will increase your haste for attacks, it will give you the greatest chance for Doom Winds to hit as often as possible. And not just that, but the 3 attacks that come with Primordial Storm during Doom Winds all can cause a Wind Fury to proc. And that's basically what you're after, is during the Doom Winds window, which is a shorter window than all of your other ones, it's only 8 seconds, you want to have as many chances for Wind Fury to come up as possible. So attacking faster and attacking more often with your abilities all make sense. I have a specific macro that I use with my Primordial Wave to give me as much haste as possible. So in the earlier section, I talked about shamanism, and I'm going to put this macro down below, is I would macro my Bloodlust to my Primordial Wave, and then have that compounded ability of haste on top of the haste that Primordial Wave gets, and have it all at once. Now, I'm also a troll, so the truth is I actually have even Berserker, my racial, tied into that macro as well. Now, I know the vast majority of no one plays a troll shaman, so we're just going to pretend that you might and put it into that burst window as well. But you're basically giving yourself as many chances as possible to hit and have Doom Winds come up. Now, from there, a few things might happen. You might instantly come back because you're doing your Doom Winds, and your Doom Winds are giving you lots of hits. Lots of hits are giving you lots of procs for Maelstrom to pop, and you might instantly go into an Elemental Blast. Now, it's possible that's not the case, in which you have to go into your filler rotation. Now, I'm going to use this as a very broad term, but your filler rotation is always going to be Ice Strike, Lava Lash, Storm Strike. Literally clicking it, and I forgot the name, mid-click. The reason you're doing it in that order is because you want your people you're fighting to be slowed at all costs, but also to give you a chance to use the Frost Shock when it pops up. So it's always going to be your first melee attack that you use. It's your highest priority in those 3 fillers, followed by Lava Lash, which comes back quite a bit when Surging Totem is down, due to the way Surging Totem gives you Hot Hands. Hot Hands is the ability that increases your damage of Lava Lash and cuts the cooldown by, I think, 45%. And then last but not least, Storm Strike. Storm Strike is basically your lowest damaged move, and is just the thing you use when you have no other buttons to press. That's all it is that you're trying to fill up and get back to your next Maelstrom. And then from there, you want to do another Elemental Blast. So you're basically coming up with a Primordial Storm, then a Elemental Blast, then another Elemental Blast. And by that time, you probably would have ran out of Doom Winds, ran out of your puppies, and then ran out of your, and your Primordial Wave will already be on cooldown. So I'm going to do this again. I'm going to do it a bit quicker this time and show you it in real time. So I'm going to just stop my fellow here, and we're going to get this in a much quicker rotation. But again, don't start off quick. Start off slow and just remember it in the right order to help you. It doesn't have to be in this order, but it does help quite a bit maximize every little millimeter of DPS that you want to get out. So, Flame Shock, Surging Totem, Dogs are coming out, Primordial Wave, Doom Winds, oh, Primordial Storm, Ice Strike. Now we got a Frost Shock before, now we're up to an Elemental Blast, Lava Lash, Storm Strike, Lava Lash, Ice Strike, and now we're up to an Elemental Blast again, and we can use our Frost Shock again. Now, as you saw in that one, my procs were a little bit against me, which happens. And sometimes you're just going to go quicker to that filler, and then sometimes you won't use that filler at all, and you'll instantly go to your next Maelstrom spender. And that's where you want to go. Now, you're done. You did all your nasty, nasty attacks, and you're in between that burst window. And during that burst window, all you're basically doing is waiting until you get 8 Maelstrom or more and using your Elemental Blast. And then, on top of that, you're using your Primordial Wave on cooldown. Whenever it comes up, you want to instantly use it. Don't even question what's going on. Maybe you're not even in melee range. The way Primordial Wave works like that is it works from when you use Primordial Wave that the cooldown starts. So you have 15 seconds to use your Primordial Storm, but if you don't use it in that time, the cooldown will still come back in 30 seconds. So it doesn't come from when you use Primordial Storm, but from when you initiate that attack. And the reason you want to use it on cooldown is that gives you the chance to use it again when your Doom Winds comes back up and you're in your second burst window, which typically is where a lot of fights are won and lost, because in a solo shuffle queue, you're going to run out and instantly start hitting your people, then you're going to use your burst window, and then you're going to use your defensive cooldowns. So a lot of the time, whatever is being focused on won't die in that window. And it's around the second burst windows with controlling the crowds that this will help. Now, the other things that I also have macroed here is on my Surging Totem, and that is a self-cast, which again, all of these are going to come up in the description below, so look for them there. But basically, every time I hit Surging Totem, the totem just is planted by my feet, and that saves me a key press from making it hit anywhere on the map. Now, I do have it a second time as a cast key off to the side at a much harder keybind. And that's to hit at range any places where I think a hunter may have camouflaged or a mage went invisible to try and bring him out of stealth, or a rogue, or a feral druid. And a lot of times, if you can get them out of stealth, you've kind of ruined their day and stopped their opener and made their lives hard. So it is a useful thing, but a lot of the time in the heat of battle, having the totem cast right at your feet so you can get back into the fight means a lot. And not only is it macroed there, but it's also macroed to my Lava Lash. And the reason is once the totem is down, it has no global cooldown to follow you every 6 seconds. And so instead of recasting the totem at my feet every 6 seconds or having to use an auxiliary button to do that or re-hit my totem, basically, every time I want to punch somebody in the face with a Lava Lash, the totem follows me. And it's just to make life a little bit easier and reduce some of the keybinds and some of the management that comes with this. And that's basically the whole rotation. You might think that the rotation will change when it comes into a group, but it doesn't, because Chain Lightning is a very low damaging move that you're always better off to use your Elemental Blast before Chain Lightning. Now, you may have consumed all of your Elemental Blast charges, and you're down to just Lightning Bolts or Chain Lightning, at which point you'd want to select the two on the size of the group. But most often, that's not going to happen, especially if you're waiting for 8 charges or more before you start using those spenders. But yeah, that's pretty much everything in a nutshell. The only other advice that may ever come up is to try and hit another ranged target with your Flame Shock before you get into your Primordial Wave, if only to spread the damage as much as possible and affect as many people as possible. But due to it being a relatively easy thing to cleanse off by all healers, you might have a little bit of a issue doing that. So just make sure your primary target at the very least is Flame Shocked, and outside of that, follow the rotation as was written and I have demonstrated. So that brings us on to the discussion of defensive cooldowns. Now, the Shaman has a fistful of wonderful defensive cooldowns. Some are even your active cooldowns, such as Static Totem or Earth Grab Totem that keeps enemies at bays. But I'm talking specifically here about your active defensive cooldowns for when everybody points at you and you find yourself pooping yourself just a little bit. Now, to start off, when they're poking at you, you always want to stick with your Earth Elemental, because this actually isn't your biggest defensive boon, but it does help you a great deal and lasts for a minute by giving you 15% more health, and as well, if you take the talent, a 5% damage reduction. And that's for a solid minute of keeping you healthier. But it's not something that's going to assuage direct damage when people look at you and really start pushing you. At that point, you want to start off first and foremost with Astral Shift, which reduces the damage you take by 40%, but most importantly is one of your shortest cooldowns for your defensive cooldowns. And you always want to pick on your shortest guys first to have them cycle back up for when you use the other ones. Now, if you've spec'd for it in your PvP spec, your next one after that would be Burrow. And again, with Burrow, you have to burrow a bit earlier than you would with anything else. Actually, all of your defensives you should probably use earlier, but Burrow is the worst because when you're underground, dots will still tick on you. So if you're fighting a Affliction Warlock and a Feral Druid and all of their dots are devouring you alive, Burrow is only going to stop them from doing direct damage, but you still will have the chance of dying underground if you don't get to a healer, which is always one of your most important and fundamental things of when you're doing a solo shuffle, is keep track of your healer, because you darting behind a pillar to try and do damage outside of the line of sight of your healer and dying helps no one. And Burrow is one of those ultimate examples of you burrow, it's always best to go back or relatively close. You never want to stand on top of your healer, but get within line of sight so they can heal you up. And hopefully they don't use any of their cooldowns on you. And last but not least is your Stone Bulwark Totem, which is a 3-minute long cooldown, but gives you, as you see, a shield for 3.5 million damage. And then a subsequent shield every second for 350,000 damage. It's not, the subsequent shield isn't that much, but definitely will at least stop some mild dots on you, let's say from an arms warrior or something like that, if they aren't actively hitting you. But that will be your last one. And hopefully, by the time you cycle through all those guys, you're back to your Astral Shift. However, and this is important, if you need to use more than one, you use more than one. Being dead does not help anything ever, especially during a solo shuffle, because then the round's over. So if you have to burrow while you're Astral Shifted, it's not ideal, but it's better than the match ending right then and there. So never be afraid to use your cooldowns in abundance or too early. And early is always the advised one, because a healer will easily keep you at 80%, then try to heal you back from a 20% deficit and get you back up to full health. So that's just something to keep the pressure off of their shoulders. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about my layout while we're in the defensive cooldowns, because as you can see, I have all of my defensive cooldowns in a singular section. So at a glance, I can tell what's going in the bottom right-hand corner of my main bar here and know that I have either the cooldowns coming up or I need to use them. And likewise, on the other side are all of my damaging cooldowns. And I put these basically at the extremes so I have a place that I can easily look to them, see where they're at, and then go back to focusing on the game or the health bars that is needed. And doing a layout in this sort of way helps you immensely. And I would even recommend to do this sort of thing even if it doesn't match your button layout, because you would rather have your buttons all over the place, but the icons in an easily and visually stunning place upon their own, than to have it all lined up perfectly with how you would have the buttons laid out on your keyboard. And that's it, and that's everything when it comes to the defensive cooldowns. So, gears and stats. When it comes down to your gears and stats and what you primarily want to focus, it isn't exactly numbers that you're chasing, but so much general sort of benchmarks that would be nice. Personally, I would rather have about 14,000 versatility, and then the rest goes into haste and mastery in various mixtures. Now, my personal preference is I have about 13,000 haste and 10,000 mastery, and that's before the PvP buffs. So with the gear just standing around normally. it comes down that I also gave myself 3 pieces of crafted gear, which was the neck and the rings, along with the 4-piece set bonus. You don't really need much more than that, as a lot of shamans have wildly different opinions about it all, where some will have almost no haste and a bunch of mastery, and others will have no mastery and a bunch of haste. What works best for you and what you feel most comfortable with, as the mastery will help you hit harder and the haste will help you hit faster and cast faster. So that's why I go with roughly a little bit more haste than I do mastery, but they are things that you can definitely mix in. Now, if you're having problems surviving, you do want to bump up that mastery or versatility quite a bit. But outside of that, it really is whatever you feel is best when it comes down to it, after you get your 4-piece set bonus of setifying your good old conquest gear. That's pretty much it. You know, stone or radiant authority on the weapons for your weapon enchants, and speed on all the other items, and yeah, it's not really much more. It's a very simple process. So, how are you? Utility. Alright, so in this part we're going to talk specifically about utility. Utility basically falls under the umbrella of anything that isn't directly being a DPS move or a defensive move that your character might have. So in the world of a shaman, you have static totems, earth grab, capacitor, grounding totems, lightning lassos, hexes, purges, cleanses, tremor totems, and heals for other people. It's true, you can actually use those heals on other players. Strange and arcane information, I know, but please take it with you. Now, quite frequently, you don't want to use these during your burst attacks, if you can help it. The thing is that if your healer gets hexed while you're in the middle of your burst window, you really do need to stop your burst window and cleanse that hex off your healer. Because again, corpses don't win solo shuffle rounds. So anytime you can prevent that from happening, it means quite a bit. But at the moment, this is going to be purely about those sort of abilities and utilities you have that will help your team or hinder their team. And quite frequently, you might want to be throwing hexes onto healers, while your partner might have a go or is doing amazing damage against one of the DPS during the solo shuffle round. And then basically a lot of the time you're going to want to wait until the end of that and then throw on another sort of crowd control to elongate it as much as possible and give them the best opportunity. Now, if the healer uses that or uses the trinket to get out of it, you're already winning on that front, because then that means something else can be used upon them and they won't have an answer for it. And any sort of crowd control can be useful against a healer, because even just earth grabbing them behind pillars or using your static field totem to drag them behind pillars out of line of sight gives your team that many more seconds into being able to defeat whoever's in front of you. And likewise, you could use it against the DPS when their pressure is high. So if your teammate is in trouble, you can use any one of those moves to ensure that you at least take one or both players out of the equation. If you're running against something like a double melee, like a warrior and rogue, and they're on top of a warlock, simply putting down an earth grab totem and allowing that warlock to walk 2 meters to the left to ensure that they can't be hit goes a long way. And always remember, especially when it comes to earth grab, to stop hitting the target that's in the earth grab. Earth grab can withstand some damage, but it withstands some damage in the same sense of a warm, gentle breeze. It will typically break with just about anything you do. So you want to basically get off of that target as immediately as possible and move on to the next target. Or even stop all DPS, because again, sometimes not doing any damage while your healer can recover your teammate might go infinite distance into you winning that round versus you feeling like you have to do damage and close out the match. You're never going to close out the match in between those burst windows if there's no crowd control on the healer. So just try to think through and think slowly about what's going to be the best next step that you can take. And sometimes that will be just keeping everybody locked down, especially in between the windows that you can do things. You also, again, have Purge, Cleanse, and Tremor Totems, which are all fantastic abilities to use against their counterparts, as you may want to cleanse a Time Warp off of a mage, or purge a Time Warp off of a mage, or cleanse a Hex off of a friendly member, or any Warlock curses to begin with. And Tremors, of course, are always fantastic things against a singular fear, or AoE fears, or charms, or sleeps. Now, I mentioned grounding before. Grounding is one of those totems that is fantastic to use, but as you get further along in the solo shuffle and higher ranks, it becomes a bit more specific of where and how you would like to use that. And a lot of that comes down to controlling crowd controls, which might sound odd the way I said it like that, but we'll avoid my terrible use of the English language and basically use it during moments of polymorph, cyclone, hexes. And this is especially useful when you're fighting, let's say, double melee who have no ranged attacks, but they have a druid or a shaman healer on their team. And I promise that grounding totem a cyclone off of a enemy druid goes a long way into preventing their damage and their pressure, because they're kind of a free member, and unless you're using your ranged shears on those cyclones as well, which is something you definitely should be doing, it's something that can really interfere with your team and put you far behind in the same way that I was talking about earlier. However, if you're against a warlock, you're typically going to want to use a destruction warlock. You're typically going to want to use that grounding totem against their chaos bolts, and use that tremor for when they fear, because what they'll try to do typically is use that fear as a bait for your wind shear and then hit you with a chaos bolt. And as always, due to the way that you're built, a lot of your shears will mitigate the damage you take against you when you keep the specific talent Seasoned Winds. And when you wind shear something like a Chaos Bolt, that actually puts you in several spell schools that you'll take 15% less damage for the next 18 seconds. As it says, it can stack up to 2 times, but that's one of those only if you hit them back to back in very narrow windows, of course. So just keep that in mind. Now, how do you track that sort of thing? Your focus frame. It's one of the best tools that Warcraft put within the UI itself, but whenever I start a match, I always ensure that I put a focus frame on the enemy healer. Now, by default in Blizzard's keybinds, holding the control key is the modifier into doing any of your spells against your focus frame. So holding control and pressing your wind shear will wind shear that target. Or control and then your hex, and that will hex the target. And that is one of the easiest and most concise ways of fighting an opponent and keeping those heals locked as much as you can, or better yet, even crowd controlled through hexes. Now, to go a little bit further upon that, I use a very specific add-on called FrameSort. And FrameSort, which I'm also going to put down in the below, is a add-on that sorts your arena frames in a specific order every time. So every time my healers come on top, my ranged casters come next, and my melee comes third. And you can specifically tell it what you want for ranged tanks, hunters, melee, and healers. And for me, my healers are always at the top and the melee are always at the bottom. And this will give you a consistent manner in which you can always hit the same target whenever you want. And so I will bind control 1, 2, 3 into these specific raid frames. And control will be my Shear. So if I hit Control 3, I will shear the healer every single time, every single match, no matter what. This takes a slightly different macro, which I'll put down below to explain as you use it through FrameSort, because FrameSort, again, uses witchcraft and chicanery to make things look slightly different, but Blizzard's standard UI is at odds with what you see due to FrameSort. So FrameSort has its own, glut of macros to ensure that you're always hitting the same target that you want to. And that's one of your best tools in ensuring that you're always hitting the same target and always keeping on your own target for the DPS until you get back up to a, again, a burst window, or at least you can mitigate their burst windows. And as I didn't mention before, and I should have, because like I said, I've been at this a few times, when you know that the enemy team is going to get into their burst windows, use your utility then to ensure that they don't. And that's something like a Shadow Dance or an Icy Veins that you'll want to Hex first, and then Lightning Lasso, or even Earth Grab. Earth Grab Totem on a warrior that is in the middle of Avatar, or a rogue that's in the middle of Shadow Dance, goes a long way into mitigating that damage when they cannot move. Now, how do you use some of your abilities here? And I'm going to show one of the more basic ones, but it is Static Totem. And Static Totem is wonderful against those range who are very slippery, like a mage or a marksman hunter, and keeps them in melee for a good long time until they break the totem. But one of the best abilities is when they're out of your range, you can simply drop the totem by them and then use the reposition ability called Totemic Projection to bring them close, just like I did there. And that ensures that they're near you and you can continuously melee on them while you're keeping them in ranged. It also has an added bonus of making it hard for people to hit. So when they aim at it and they're about to hit it, all of a sudden it's pushed behind them and they lose track of it. And it gives you, again, maybe a global and a half before it's destroyed. But that global and a half is a global and a half where you're doing a primordial storm on that enemy. Another one to use is to combo your moves together. Now, you're against a rogue and a warrior, and they're beating the crap out of you. And then on top of it, all of their kicks and pummels are saved just for you because they aren't near any healers or any other ranged. And so you'll typically try to cast a Hex, and they'll instantly smash you in the face for your hubris. What you can do is drop a Capacitor Totem, which is your totem that stuns them for 3 seconds on top of everybody. Then during that stun, push it into a Hex, because a Hex is a 1.5 second cast. And with all of the haste that you might have, and if you put yourself in the middle of a Primordial Wave with a, Feral Spirit coming out, or not Feral Spirit, Bloodlust, that's the one I was going for, that also reduces your haste. That cast gets shorter and shorter, that you can easily use within a Capacitor Totem's range. So once the totem goes off, you Hex. Before they're out of the stun, they're ready to be hexed. And you could put that onto a healer to put them behind, or again, put it on one of the melee to get pressure off of you. It's fantastic stuff to use, and as you play more and more, you get far more easier at understanding what you need to do at the moment. Because hexing a healer while everybody's at full health does not amount to much, because that healer will be able to get out or even sit through the full Hex and not worry about anything. So you typically want to try to use that when people are losing their health as it goes, so that you can maximize it. And conversely, it's the total opposite of when it comes to trying to dissuade pressure upon you or your teammates, because if you're getting hit, much like I said about the defensives, you want to use that early to try and mitigate stuff as much as possible. But that's pretty much everything at the moment, as far as I could gather there. I hope everyone enjoyed it, finds some use out of this, and finds some use out of the macros and the add-ons that I'll put in the section below. I can't thank you enough for joining me, and I hope that you comment, subscribe, like, follow, dance a small jig, if that's one of the options. I think I might end up doing that myself. And myself, I'm gonna hit the old dusty trails, so I hope everyone has a wonderful evening or day, rest, whatever comes up next. I hope it's fantastic, and thank you so much for joining me.